So the death of Johnny Storm is one of the greatest moments in the history of Marvel and the Fantastic Four. And while we did cover it originally when we did Jonathan Hickman's entire run of the Fantastic Four, those of you guys who remember those videos, there was a lot happening. And so we weren't really able to provide the kind of attention that the story arc needed. So I wanted to pluck it out from Hickman's Fantastic Four run and talk about it in isolation. And what's so cool about the death of Johnny Storm is that it is incredibly emotional. And in fact, Jonathan Hickman drew on a couple different things when it came to the character of Johnny and giving us this death from Fantastic Four 587. And the two things that he drew on were the nature of Johnny as a character and the annihilation wave. Now, the annihilation wave, and some of you guys may be familiar with this, so bear with me in case you are. For those of you guys who have not heard of that, the annihilation wave was based on a story called Annihilation. And there's a Fantastic Four villain named Annihilus, a lot of you guys have probably heard of him, that he resides in the negative zone. And he's basically a nihilist, right? He believes life is meaningless. And so the goal of Annihilus is to destroy all life everywhere he finds it. And so Annihilation was a story where he invaded the main Marvel universe. And the annihilation wave was literally just an army of bugs. But you're talking trillions upon trillions of bugs. It's a war of attrition. And that's why if you skip the prelude and you crack open Annihilation and start with issue number 1, it literally opens up with the various superheroes of the universe either defeated or fleeing for their lives from the annihilation wave, literally evacuating worlds, the whole 9 yards. It was pretty crazy when the story happened. Now, of course, this led to Annihilus capturing Galactus and overpowering him and so on and so forth. Eventually, Galactus is freed and wipes out pretty much the entire annihilation wave. But that was a very important part of what Hickman was doing. For the character of Johnny Storm, while there are all kinds of comics that we could cite and things like that, the best depiction to understand Johnny's character is actually the Chris Evans depiction from the old Fantastic Four films, that he was very much a reckless character, kind of out there doing his own thing. And that's why, while the story of Johnny's death happens in Fantastic Four 587, it actually goes all the way back to Fantastic Four 578. And that's when Jonathan Hickman introduced something called the Cult of the Negative Zone. And it was basically individuals who existed on Earth that had come to believe in the idea of Annihilus. And in fact, there were members of the Annihilation Wave that were part of the Cult of the Negative Zone. And so while the Annihilation Wave was always working to reopen the portal to the Negative Zone and to restore the Annihilation Wave forces, bring Annihilus into the universe and wipe everything out, the humans who were part of the Cult of the Negative Zone believed in the idea of life everlasting, right? That within the main Marvel universe, that the universe came into existence, it will eventually die. And so while people on Earth die, and then that's essentially it, in the negative zone, they could live forever, right? So it was very much a religious cult. And what had happened in 578 is that Johnny had gone to a bar called the Other Side of Zero, which is where the Cult of the Negative Zone resided. He ended up coming across this girl who was super hot, and then it turned out she was a member of the cult. And she tried to activate the Negative Zone portal and successfully did it. And so when that happened, that's where Johnny's recklessness came into play, because without really giving a lot of thought to what was going on, he ended up following her into the negative zone. And when he got there, what he found was a kind of civil war, right, going on between the forces of Annihilus and another guy named Baxter. You don't really have to go into the nature of this civil war. Just know that Annihilus's forces basically won. But what was so important about this is that Johnny kept the portal open, and then eventually he ends up making his escape and coming back and closing the portal. Once that part of the story is all said and done, he has this conversation with Reed Richards, and Reed kind of chastises him. But the nature of the conversation is wildly fascinating, because what Reed does is he sits down with him and he says, look, everyone around here is changing. I'm changing, Susan's changing, Ben's changing. We're all changing in a variety of different ways. We're growing. Right? We are not really the kind of traditional superheroes that we used to be, right? We've sort of transcended that. And there's a lot of things happening out there right now. And so he tells Johnny, he's like, a time is going to come when you are going to meet a circumstance and you're going to have to ask yourself, who are you? What do you stand for? And in that moment, it'll be put up or shut up, and you will figure out who you are and what you're about. Now, Reed in that context was talking about the idea of like the Council of Reeds and the possibility of sacrificing his family in order to join the council and basically work on fixing the problem of everything, right? That's not overly important to the story of Johnny dying, but it does provide a little bit of context in terms of why Reed approached the whole situation with an attitude of it being of the utmost importance. This was also coupled with the fact of Johnny recognizing that by leaving the negative zone portal open, at any point forces could have passed through it. They could have shown up in the Baxter building and they could have killed everybody. They could have invaded the city of New York. The entire annihilation wave of Annihilus himself could have realized the portal was open and they could have invaded. It was him just not paying attention to what was going on around him, being so caught up in what he was doing in that moment that nothing else really seemed to matter. And so all that came to a head in the story arc called 3. And that's when you get into the death of Johnny Storm. Now, technically, it doesn't really start to happen until you get to Fantastic Four 585, because that's when the cult of the Negative Zone starts to make its move. But there were a few things happening around this time that prevented the Fantastic Four from operating as a unified team. At this point in the story, you basically found out that there was another group of Atlanteans that existed out there. So Susan Storm is working with Namor the Submariner to deal with that. And then Reed Richards was on a mission with Galactus, where Galactus basically revealed that he was afraid of Franklin because Franklin's powers were re-emerging. So everybody's kind of scattered. At that point in the story, when the cult makes its move, the only occupants of the Baxter building are Ben Grimm, Johnny Storm, Franklin, Valeria, Leech, and the other members of the Future Foundation. Now, the Future Foundation, as a quick aside, was basically a think tank composed of kids. But the idea here is that when the cult makes its move, that it basically overwhelms the entirety of the Baxter building, right? That no one was really prepared for it. And in fact, what the cult had been doing was acquiring resources and kind of building these artifacts around the Baxter building in various buildings, so that when these artifacts were activated, it would allow the cult to override the security of the Baxter building and allow them to invade. Because a lot of you guys can probably imagine, the Fantastic Four headquarters is not a place you just walk into, right? There's a lot of security when it comes to that facility. And so quite literally, when the cult makes its move and it starts to invade, they just pop up inside the Baxter building. There's no real portal that they come from. They literally just teleport in there. And so as far as Ben and Johnny and the other members of the Future Foundation are concerned, it's really more of just some kind of crazy invasion that they weren't prepared for. And while Johnny does not initially notice due to everything else that's going on, Franklin and Valeria and the other kids in the Future Foundation, they realize that there's bugs here. And so what ends up happening is that in the middle of this fight, when Johnny shows up, some of these have been destroyed by members of the Future Foundation, but they basically say like they're weird bug type people. And that's when it occurs to Johnny, it's the Negative Zone, the Annihilation wave. And what they're trying to do is open the portal from this side. Now, what complicates things a little more is that ever since the events of Doom War, when Dr. Doom orchestrated a coup d'etat in Wakanda and stole all the vibranium, the only way to defeat him with all the vibranium was to render all vibranium across the world inert. They just became useless chunks of rock. And while that impacted the Black Panther mythos and Wakanda in its own way, the portal to the Negative Zone used vibranium. And so because vibranium didn't work anymore, Reed had to kind of find a backup way to power the shielding of the Negative Zone portal, but it had been yet untested. So there was no real way to know if the shielding would hold against an invasion of billions and billions of bugs. But what happens is that with Johnny and Ben and all these guys realizing they're going for the Negative Zone portal, and then realizing that some of the kids are missing and they've gone to the lab as well, now they have two concerns. What if the cult of the Negative Zone opens the portal? But more so than that, what if they kill the kids on the way there? So it's kind of a mad dash, right, to get to this Negative Zone portal. Because once they actually get to the lab, that's when you pick up with those iconic comic book panels that so many of you have seen before. Ben Grimm toting a massive gun that was given to him by Valeria, Franklin Richards, whose powers have returned, but at the moment, his powers are basically neutralized. The reason why that happened in the Fantastic Four comics is because there is a mutant named Leech, and Leech has the ability to nullify and suppress the powers of anyone he's around, and there is no limit to this. We learned about that when he shut down the powers of Absalom Mercator, a guy that had the ability to manipulate matter, but also being able to suppress the powers of Franklin Richards. And so what ends up happening is, because of the dire nature of this situation, Leech asks somebody to knock him out, because as long as he's unconscious, his powers don't work. And so they knock him unconscious, Franklin's powers kick back up. And that's when you get that iconic panel where Franklin's like, bug spray, right? And starts blasting, all these Negative Zone monsters that are starting to come through the portal that's been blown open by the cult of the Negative Zone. And so while those forces here on Earth have basically been defeated, now the big concern is the entire Negative Zone itself. And the kids are trying to figure out how to handle this portal, right? They're trying to figure out what to do. Now, one of the other cool things that goes on here, and I don't think this is something that we initially covered when we did the story of Johnny Storm's death originally, is that Ben Grimm actually calls for backup. He gets a hold of the Avengers. And so the Avengers are essentially on their way here in the time that this is happening. And so it kind of gave us this unofficial ticking clock, right? From the time that he shows up and says, I reached out for backup, the Avengers are on their way, to the time that Johnny essentially dies, we're talking 5 minutes. If that. And this is where Johnny becomes probably one of the greatest, he gets one of the greatest character moments in the entirety of Marvel. Because what they realize is that the only way to secure the negative zone portal is to close it from the other side. They have to travel to the negative zone and close the portal from that side. And then somebody has to come back through before the portal's closed, and then they shut it from the Earth side. And that way it's secured on both sides. And so while Bentley, one of the members of the Future Foundation, is watching on, he kind of tells everybody, right? Like, we have very little time here, right? He says, as expected, the initial invasion force was to secure and dilate the portal. The larger annihilation wave is a defense perimeter positioned some 250,000 kilometers away. Assuming they've been alerted and are not just going to bomb us and the gate to death from above, figure maximum velocity, landing, disembarking, maybe 4 minutes. That's all we have between the time they're out there and the time they get here. But what makes this even more difficult is the fact that Reed Richards personally programmed this entire portal, and they don't know how the portal works. They don't know how all the different security mechanisms and whatnot function. Now, Valeria is every bit as smart as Reed, but if she doesn't know the steps he took to make everything work, she doesn't know exactly how to do it. Not only that, they realize that their traditional plan of someone activating the shielding, getting through before the shielding closes, and then shutting the portal down from the other side won't work. That because of the fact that they can't figure out how to make all this function, the amount of time they need to make it work is more time than they have. So they come up with the idea of like detonating a bomb from the other side. They can build one fairly quickly within a few minutes. I mean, you're talking about genius level kits. The issue is someone has to stay behind and activate it. Now, here's one of the other cool kickers that goes on with this whole thing. A lot of you guys probably notice Ben Grimm is human. And the reason for that is because the Future Foundation had actually created a formula. These kids created a formula that would make Ben Grimm normal for like a week. And so this is sort of the end of that week. The formula is effectively going away. Now, what Ben didn't know, and it's something that's actually focused later on in Jonathan Hickman's run, is that a consequence of this formula is that it actually prolongs Ben Grimm's life. And so he'll live for 1,000 years instead of living a shorter period of time. He'll outlive all his friends and family. But it's a pretty sad story, truthfully, in Marvel Comics for Ben Grimm. But the point is, he decides to stay behind because in his mind, this has been the greatest week of his life. And if someone's going to stay behind, it might as well be him. He can go out on a high note. And so that's why he says, Johnny, like, get all the kids and get to the other side. Now, this is where it starts to get really emotional here, because what happens is that Johnny doesn't want to see this happen. And it's kind of a testament to the relationship between the two, because yes, Johnny Storm gives Ben Grimm a hard time all the time. He pranks him, he tricks him. But when it all comes down to it, these guys are basically brothers, and they love each other like brothers, and neither one wants to see the other die. And that's why Ben tells him, like, because of you, I just had one of the best weeks of my life. There's no way that I go out owing you. Because of course, while the Future Foundation gave Ben the formula, Johnny helped him enjoy the best week of his life. And that's why Johnny's like, I mean, there's got to be something that you're not thinking of, right? Like, isn't there anything else? And it's a very sad moment because Valeria's like, no, there is no other option here. Someone has to stay behind and sacrifice themselves. And so that's where Johnny's like, okay, then that settles it. And that's where he's told, like, you know, they're coming in, like they're on their way here. And Johnny grabs Ben and throws him through the other side of the portal. And it becomes so emotional because like Ben Grimm is like cussing and screaming at him. He was like, why would you do this? And so it's essentially the shielding that like cuts off Johnny from everybody else. And Ben Grimm is like screaming and hollering. He's like beating on the wall. And so one of the cool things that goes on, right, is Valeria tells him, okay, here's how you activate it. But understand, Dad will have a backdoor built in. When you activate this code, right, it's going to make it so no one can open the portal again. But we have a backdoor. We can get you to this other side. And Johnny just kind of looks at him for a second and he's like, entering the code. And then he just looks at Ben and he says, when you see Reed, tell him this is where I made my stand. And he engages the locking mechanism and shuts the door. And the whole time, like, that's when Ben realizes, oh my God, he's going to stay and he's going to die. And Ben just starts like beating on the door. He's like, John, no! And like Ben starts to turn back into his thing form. And then you get this really touching moment between the two of them where like Johnny's just like unbelievable, right? He was like, you don't wish it any more than I do. Like, I don't want to die, man, but someone has to stay behind. And so then you get this super amazing moment. And all of you guys have seen this before. All of you guys have seen this moment in the death of Johnny Storm, where like he turns around, the annihilation wave is there, right? Billions of bugs that are coming at him. The end is imminent. And so he's just like 1,000,000,000. Like, you think I'm afraid of that? You think I'm afraid of that? And he's just like, flame on! And it's like the last thing you see, because like the portal like literally it starts to close and all these things are swarming onto Johnny. And like Ben Grimm is watching it all go down and he just cries. And like all that happens here is you have Ben Grimm on the other side of the portal with the kids and they're all just crying. But what's better than the death of Johnny Storm, right? What's better than this comic where Johnny dies is the comic that comes after. Because after Johnny's death, right, you go directly into Fantastic Four 588. And this is a comic that has no speech whatsoever. No one says anything, but it is done so perfectly well that you get the message every single time, because it's simply called A Month of Mourning. And the whole comic takes place over the course of like 30 days. So immediately after the portal closes and after Johnny's basically dead, the Avengers arrive on the scene and Johnny's already gone. And it's just like this incredibly sad moment because Ben just looks at them, right? His eyes are red, he's crying, and the Avengers realize like this is it. Within moments of that, Susan Storm teleports back, only to be told her brother's dead. And Susan's reaction to this whole thing is phenomenal because by day 3, she's just like sitting on her bed and just grieving. And like Reed tries to touch her and it's almost like a subconscious thing. Reed goes in to touch her and try to comfort her and she puts this force field around herself. And she's like, I don't want to be around anybody. Like, I don't want to be around anyone. I don't want to see anyone. And so then you pick up with day 4 where Reed goes and he grabs the ultimate nullifier. And this was Hickman showing us just how much Reed was grieving over the death of Johnny, because the ultimate nullifier is no small thing, right? That its abilities sort of shift based on the mental fortitude of the person wielding it. If you put it in the hands of somebody who's not very intelligent, they'll probably just end up destroying themselves. You put it in the hands of someone like Reed, he can obliterate an entire universe. And so he ends up opening, like going to the negative zone portal and opening it up. And Annihilus is standing there, and while the shielding's still in place, so Annihilus cannot pass through, Reed holds the nullifier up to him, and then Annihilus just holds up the shirt of Johnny Storm, just kind of taunting him, right? And then in Reed just turns around and closes the portal and walks away. And so you go into like the funeral of Johnny Storm. And this was a beautiful moment because it was a testament to how significant the Fantastic Four were in the Marvel Universe. The reality here is that for a long time, both on the publishing side of Marvel and within the main Marvel Universe itself, the Fantastic Four have not been a traditional superhero team. They don't really fight villains in the traditional sense, the way the X-Men might do, or the Avengers, or even Black Panther or Captain America or whoever. The Fantastic Four have transcended all of that. And they've reached a level where they're more of just like an exploratory team. They go out there and they see what the universe has to offer. They chart these brave new worlds and uncharted places. And so the role they play in terms of kind of leaders to the next frontier of the superhero community, right? Standing on one accomplishment and then looking to the next, it places them heads and shoulders above everybody else. And so one of the other things that goes on, and this is a phenomenal moment, I actually almost cried during this particular moment, is the way that Ben Grimm grieves, because there's this awesome moment where you have like all these X-Men and you have these Avengers who are all saying their kind words to the Fantastic Four, and it just shows Ben Grimm sitting against a wall, and it just kind of zooms in closer and closer, and Ben's just full of anger and rage, right? He's just 8 kinds of pissed off. And so one of the things that happens is that by day 26, he's kind of like out there in this field, right? He literally comes out there to meet with Donald Blake. Of course, you guys know him as the alter ego of Thor, and Bruce Banner. And they initially show him Johnny. And it's kind of their way of saying, like, you have to grieve, right? You have to accept this. I know it's hard, but it's also a part of life. And so when that happens, Thor calls down the thunder and like turns into his Thor form. And then like Ben Grimm punches him. And then Bruce Banner turns into the Incredible Hulk and he hits Ben. And initially it just kind of seems like them sort of forcing their will on him, when in reality what they realize is that what Ben needs is to just get his anger out. He needs to hit something. And so these guys are just pummeling each other, because the reality is that Thor and Hulk are the only ones who can take it. But like while they're fighting, and while like literally Ben's throwing a fantastic car and they're just ripping everything to pieces, they all just start crying. And it's like incredibly emotional. It's so beautifully done. Like it's just, it brought me to tears. When I was reading this, man, I was just like, oh my God, like this was just such an emotional comic. And so the last little bit that you get there is sort of Reed Richards on day 29, where he's just grieving about the death of Johnny. And he's keeping all of it inside. He's not really talking to anybody. He's not communicating with anybody. And a lot of this is because Reed had put so much pressure on himself to solve every problem that goes on out there that he's kind of destroying his mental health. But he goes through this sort of list of all the things that he's wrestling with, right? Invasion from the negative zone, threat level, high. Invasion from universal inhumans, threat level, high. Celestial invasion via the bridge, medium. That was the mad celestials invading from an alternate reality, right? Franklin's abilities returning and the danger that poses, threat level, high, right? Galactus's destruction of Earth, threat level, high. Reformation of the Council of Reeds, necessary. And so one of the last things you get here is a portal suddenly opens and Reed Richards' father returns. Now that was a really, really mind-blowing moment in the comic, because it really kind of fits into the larger narrative of the story that Jonathan Hickman was telling. And if you guys are interested in that, again, I have a playlist with his entire Fantastic Four run, but this is the kind of stuff you get during Hickman's Fantastic Four. It is the greatest run in the history of the entire story. But the last little tidbit that I want to throw in, right, because I don't know how many people are aware of this, is the conversation between Franklin Richards and Spider-Man. Because Spider-Man actually ends up coming on as part of the Future Foundation due to Johnny Storm's death, and also because of the fact that Spider-Man and Johnny Storm were basically best friends. They were incredibly close friends. And so you get this really, really amazing conversation between Franklin and Peter Parker, where Franklin starts saying things like, you know, I could have saved Johnny, right? I could have made it so he didn't die, which is actually a true statement, because the undercurrent throughout all of Hickman's run is that Franklin Richards' powers had basically been restored to him by his future version. But his future version was teaching Franklin how to use his abilities, but told him, you're not supposed to use them. Bad things are going to happen. You're going to want to use your powers to help people. You can't. It's going to be hard to do, but you cannot do that. And that all came to a head in the moment when Franklin used his abilities to resurrect Galactus from the dead, right? So he was basically kind of storing his powers, holding on to it, so he wasn't really running out of his abilities or anything along those lines. But the bigger point here is that Spider-Man, of course, lost his Uncle Ben, and Franklin just lost his Uncle Johnny. And as the two of them are talking, it actually allows Spider-Man to take Franklin out on the town and for the two of them to just sort of clear their minds for a little while, really more for Franklin than anything else. And there's this really, really cool moment, right, where Peter is talking to Franklin and he says, I don't know if your mom or dad have told you this or not, but when I was younger, not your age, a little bit older, but still too young, I lost my Uncle Ben as well. We were very close, like you and Johnny were. Did you know that? And Franklin says, no, like what happened? And Peter says he was killed in a robbery. And he says, not a day goes by that I don't think about him, not a single one, but it doesn't make me sad anymore. I mean, sure, I wish he was still here, and God, I do miss him, but after a while, the dark thoughts, the bad ones, like you're having now, they will fade away, and you'll spend most of your time thinking about how much fun you had together, or how much you loved him. And the question that Franklin has is a question asked from the perspective of a child, grieving over the loss of his uncle. How long before that happens? And that's true, right? Whenever we lose somebody who's close to us, we oftentimes wish we could just fast forward to the time when everything's okay. A phenomenal quote from the show Insecure. I don't know if you guys saw that, but Peter just says it takes a while, right? Like there is no real way in which this is done, right? You can't fast forward to when everything's okay. And that's when Franklin reveals to him. He's like, can I tell you a secret, Spider-Man? And Spider-Man says, of course you can. And Franklin says, I think I could have stopped Uncle Johnny from dying. And Peter responds in probably one of the greatest responses ever. He's like, okay, well, I promise that I'll keep that to myself. Can I tell you a secret? And Franklin says, okay. And Peter says, I know I could have stopped my uncle from dying. And it's just this really, really important thing, because Franklin asks, then why didn't you? If you could have stopped it, why didn't you stop it? And Spider-Man just says, because I was young, because I didn't understand how important every single decision we make is, because I had to learn that when you have gifts like ours, you don't think about yourself first. You think about how lucky you are to have them and how much other people need help. It's what my uncle would have wanted from me, and it's what your Uncle Johnny would want from you now. But again, it's this really touching moment between the two. But the death of Johnny was just this incredible moment in Marvel. It was a phenomenal storyline in Marvel Comics. So whether it is that you want to see my videos on it or you want to actually read it yourself, I highly suggest that you do. If you want to get into like the meat and potatoes of it, it's simply the Fantastic Four. Just look for the story arc 3. That's the whole thing that covers the death of Johnny Storm. But it's an incredible comic. Oh my God, it's absolutely beautiful. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. You guys want me to like pick out moments from Hickman's Fantastic Four run and kind of cover them here? Because it is a pretty significant run. A lot of stuff happens. It's very easy to kind of get confused and to feel lost because of everything that goes on. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.